Welcome back. Well, these days they call them graphic novels. They used to call them comic books. But this book, March, is anything but superhero fiction. Instead, it's a series telling the real-life story of John Lewis, Bloody Sunday, and the rest of the civil rights movement of the 1960s in a way that just may appeal to millennials born decades after it all went down. March, Part 2 of the trilogy, has just been released. And joining me now is Andrew Iden. He is co-author of March, and he wrote it alongside Congressman Lewis and artist Nate Powell. Andrew, so good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
You know, we just heard that Congressman Lewis was inspired, at least in part, by an MLK comic book from so long ago. But did you know that when you brought the idea to him?
No, I mean, when I brought the idea to him, he actually had told me that you know, this was something that was very serious to him. People were teasing me for going to a comic book convention. He said, don't laugh, there was a comic book during the movement. And it was influential.
Yeah.
And I actually went on to write my graduate thesis about that comic book because it played such an important role in the movement.
All right, so then how do you go from that to, let's tell the whole story of the movement in a comic book?
Well, part of it has to be with being 24 years old and not knowing any better when you address an icon like John Lewis. And just saying, you know, when he told me about it, I just started thinking, well, why don't you write a comic book? And it was, remember, it was 2008. It was the summer of hope and change. Barack Obama was sweeping through the Democratic primaries. And so I just started asking him, and finally he said, okay, I'll do it, but only if you write it with me.
Yeah. I like the way you told the story. You made it kind of autobiographical through the eyes of John Lewis. Talk a little bit about how that came about.
Well, so often you see the congressman telling these stories to young people, to kids, to people not so young. And they don't know it, but when you hear his voice and you see the way he says it and how it resonates, that was the experience we were trying to capture. Because it shouldn't be just me or the one person in the room who has that experience. This should be something that is preserved for this generation and the next.
Is that what you wanted to do? Get to the next generation who's probably not going to go back and watch Eyes on the Prize or read the book. They may not know the history, and 50 years ago to them might as well be a century ago.
Absolutely. I think this generation is frustrated. They're frustrated with the status quo, but they haven't been taught how to protest, what nonviolence really is, how to be successful with civil disobedience. And they also, I mean, they don't, the history of the civil rights movement isn't taught in school.
Yeah, we can't get out of here without talking about Nate Powell, your artist.
Oh, absolutely.
Great job. You mentioned that part of his issue was finding the photograph so he could represent this the right way.
Right. Nate put a tremendous amount of effort into making sure that every detail was correct. I think at this point he's probably got a relationship with just about every living photographer from the civil rights movement. They've been incredibly helpful, and when you go through it, you see it's not just the expressions or the people's faces that are likeness, but the clothes, the cars, the details that you wouldn't even think, but to a trained artist like Nate, he really got in there and did a spectacular job.
And Part 2 is out now. That goes from 1965 to...
Well, Part 2 picks up with the stand-in movement, which happened in Nashville in 1960, and carries you through the Freedom Rides, the Birmingham campaign in '63, and then into the March on Washington.
We'll look forward to that and Part 3 as well. From one comic book fan to another, great job. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Good conversation. We enjoyed it a lot. All right, folks, coming up, which Republican female is making moves towards a presidential bid? That and a lot more in On Politics from USA Today.